I think it's time for me to start. Second talk. There's quite some overlap, but not too much, I hope. For the parts that overlap, at least you get the feeling that we both think they are important. Although sometimes it's small features, it's very helpful features. As with Jim, if you have questions, simply ask them. Don't wait until the end of the talk. There might be no time at the end. Ask your questions, and we'll see how it goes. So first off, about me, my name is Jung. I'm also part of the project and a member of the AMS. I'm doing lots of performance analysis and other troubleshooting. So I do have contact a lot with real production environments. What's the goal of this talk? I will show nice little tricks, not the big picture. And most of the tricks, or many of those tricks, are not well known, and you should try them and see how they help in your work. I will not describe general best practice. This is really picking some small things that might be useful. None of the features need any third-party module. Anything comes with Apache 2.4. So what's the list that we're going through? Define. I'll maybe have some different examples and some additional information. Modmacro, per module log levels. Then something about access logs and what you should or can configure there to help correlation ID forwarding, modlog debug, if with expressions, location match, and especially for location match named back references. Then mod remote IP and some special modSSL configuration directive. That's the list of my 10 things that I want to show you. So first, number one, define. Define defines global config variables. Many of you will use, for instance, ModRewrite to define request environment variables. Those are per request variables. Define defines global variables that are configured for all of the runtime of the server. And the syntax is just define, then the variable name, and then the value. And you can use the variable anywhere in your configuration with the notation $, and then parentheses and the name of the variable inside. So for instance, proxy path / app HTTPS, and then I add this $stage there. You could also, some people know this notation $parentheses from old times where you could reference operating system environment variables like this. But there's an important difference. An operating system environment variable you cannot change during runtime because it's inherited from the starting process. So even doing a restart or a graceful, you cannot change the operating system environment variable in your env file. You can change it, but it won't make the way into the process. Define variables you can define inside the config. So you can change it, do a graceful, and then the new value immediately gets effective. So, typically, you would factor out names or sizings that occur at multiple places in your configuration, and then in which you would change, for instance, to have different values on different stages. Yeah? Then you can factor it out, replace it by variables. Your configuration files get constant, and you move all the defines into a specially included file where you have an immediate overview of the varying values that you are using. If you need to undefine a variable, yes? If it, yes, it's an empty string then. It's an empty string. Or, no, it's actually, it's throwing an error, I think. It's throwing a warning that the variable doesn't exist. It's throwing a warning that it doesn't exist. Yes, yes. You can undefine a variable. That's an unusual thing to do. And you can check for the definition of a variable, not for its value, unfortunately. We'll come back to this point later, but for whether a variable is defined or not, you can do a conditional configuration with if define. If define, people used, even in previous versions, they defined variables with the -d flag on startup. But with -d, you can only set a variable, but not to a value. It's defined, it's there, but you cannot change, you cannot assign it a value. With define, you can assign an actual value. And a negation for if define, you add the exclamation mark. So, for instance, here's a configuration snippet similar to Jim's, where the -d and the define notations are combined. With the -d test during startup, you decide which of the two blocks get active, and then in the two blocks we define variables which we use further on in the configuration. So number 2 is modmacro, using templates. A macro is a config snippet with parameters. So again, it's the vhost macro, similar to what Jim does, because that's boilerplate code that you have a lot in your configurations, so you want to shorten that. And be careful, using too many macros might make your configuration hard to read for newcomers. But sometimes it makes it more expressive because you can remove the boilerplate part of the configuration and condense it down into a single token with parameters. Yeah? So you have to be careful doing it in the right amount, not because Apache complains, but because you still need to understand your configuration. So Apache expands all of these macros and defines during configuration parsing. It's not done during request processing. It's done at startup time during configuration parsing. So, and then you actually include the macro as an active part of your configuration with the use command, like this. Slight change to your template is Jim included the virtualhostlines in the macro, and I excluded them to be able to add more lines to the virtual host block. Yeah, so it adjusts to your needs, yeah, as always. So what's the difference? I mean, define is especially useful if the same value is used in several places and you want to factor out this value in a central place to control it easily there. Macro is more useful if you have a complex block of configuration that repeats but has slightly changed values. These you then inject via the parameters. So both help you reorganize your configuration, but for slightly different targets. Number 3, per module lock levels. In the past, you could only change the lock level globally for the server. And then, for instance, if you had proxy or SSL running and you changed your lock level to debug, you got flooded by log lines because they logged a lot on the debug lock level. There was no chance doing it in production. Now you can do the module the log configuration on a per module basis. For instance, you could say my log level is info, but for the rewrite module, I'll want to see everything, because I need to debug some rules I did make with the Swiss Army knife, but they are not working as expected. And there's some other thing hidden in this line. The 2.2 people will remember that they had the rewrite log level directive, with which you could only for ModRewrites had already set an individual log level. The rewrite log level directive is gone, and the log levels 1 to 9, I think, have been mapped to the new log levels debug to trace 8 in this new framework. So, and you can do that, as Jim already said, even in a virtual host or directory context, and you can do it even more specific. I'll come back to that later. So number 4, and I think that's one of the small things that are really useful. By default, the timestamps in the access logs are on a second basis. You have the hour, minute, and the second, but you don't have a finer time granularity. The web server does have it, but it doesn't put it into the access log. And for compatibility reasons and this old common log format definition, etc., we didn't change the default format. But I would encourage you to change it, to include subsecond granularity to your timestamps. And the way to do it is looks a bit ugly. It's here, and typically in your log format, access log format, there is somewhere a %t. That's the timestamp. And what you can add now is you can add with curly braces some terminology that determines what is written for this timestamp, what part of the timestamp, in which format. And most of it, like here, there is a % curly braces, then some string, end of the curly braces t. This string comes from the definition of the C function string format time, strf time. It already exists, and it has lots of characters where you define whether you want to have a numeric month format, a string month format, a short one, a localized one, etc. You can use all of the characters here that your strftime implementation supports. And we add it because strftime is also very old. It doesn't know about subsecond granularity. It ends with a second. So we added some proprietary definitions, and this is the one here, for instance, says add the fraction behind the second in microseconds. So this will add a 6-digit subsecond timestamp. And the Z is just for the time zone. So this will print a time format like you're used to, except that after the seconds there's a dot and then the 6 digits microseconds. So, and I should say all of that is also in the documentation. This is not like we just tell it people. All of the patterns are listed, and you can look at that. So, more on access log timestamps. One thing is, if you have HTTPD as a reverse proxy, for instance, in front of a Tomcat, then by default, HTTPD logs the request begin time as the timestamp in the access log. Tomcat, by default, logs the end time as the timestamp in the access log. Yeah? That's due to historic reasons for the implementation. Nowadays, you can switch it for HTTPD and also for Tomcat. You can, in both, you can choose whether you want to log the begin or the end time. You can also log both if you like to. And for this, there is a little token you can add in front of the pattern that determines that you actually want the end time to get logged and not the begin time. And it works very similar in the Tomcat world. So, more about access log. Not included by default, but I would very much urge you to add it, is %D. That's the request duration in microseconds. And it's not that we do, it's not expensive. You should always add it. Once you run into problems, it's so important to understand what takes long. Which type of request is it? Is it specific IP, specific user agent, specific URIs? So please add %D to your access log lines. That's very important. Another token that's very important is %L. That's a correlation ID. That's a unique ID. It changes every time it's printed. And whenever there's an error log line written for a request, the error log line contains the same unique ID. So it's easy to correlate between the error log and the access log. If an error is written to the error log, you grab the correlation ID, you grab your access log, you get exactly one hit, and that's the request that had the error. Yeah? So, but the correlation ID is only filled if anything gets written to the error log. So as long as nothing gets written, it's just an empty position in the log file. Say again, please? Yes, it's always unique. It's always unique. And to improve, you should actually activate modUnique ID. Then the %L is the unique ID generated by modUnique ID. It's not a UUID. Okay, and if you like, you can also add the Unix timestamp of the request, but with a microsecond resolution, because that's easier to do calculations on than a formatted timestamp. Yeah, if you like to do calculations on the request begin times, end times, etc., in a numeric way, then sometimes it's easier to have the timestamps like this. And you can add multiple of those. It's not that you need to choose between formatted and numeric. You can add all of them if you like. So some of my additional favorites, %P and TIDP, that's the process ID and the thread ID. Sometimes that's interesting how the requests behave with respect to distribution on processes or threads. And %K, %X, that's, K is a number, that's how many keep alive requests have been done on the current connection. And the X is what's the connection, what will the web server do with the connection next? Will it close it? Will it keep it open? It's just a single character that indicates the connection status at the end of the request. Number 5, correlation ID forwarding. Sometimes you want to correlate something happening or some measurement on your web server with a proxied backend that's behind the web server. If you want to correlate not only statistically, but instead on a per request basis, then you need to have some ID to match. You cannot just use the timestamp. You have thousands of requests per second, and the timestamp is not working as a correlation method. So we want to have a correlation ID. What we can easily do is we should generate an ID and send it to the backend. So the question is, how do we generate a unique request ID? And there's already an old module in there that does it. It's mod unique ID. You simply load it, and then it generates automatically a request ID. And the request ID is put into an environment variable by mod unique ID automatically. That's this environment variable, request environment variable. So if you want to log it in the web server, just add it to the access log format, % parentheses unique ID E. That's, yes? So it will automatically create a requester for the downstream host? Mod unique ID will create a unique ID for every request that hits the Apache. For every request, yes. Independent of whether you serve it from the disk or whether you proxy it to somewhere. Yeah, that's the next step. That's the next step. Okay. Next slide. So the first step is we need a request ID. We generate it like this. Now, what do we do locally? We log it. And remember, %L will then have the same value. The error log will also contain this unique ID. And how do we forward it to the backend? Yeah, since we're typically talking HTTP and an is an extensible protocol, we can add a custom header. We just choose some conflict-free header name, like xRequestID. And then we use mod headers to forward our request ID, our unique request ID, in this header to the backend. Yeah, and as you can see, mod headers supports using variables in the value string. Yeah, so it evaluates the string at runtime. So, okay, so now we already sent it to the backend. What to do on the backend? The next thing is, on the backend, we can also add the header to the access log if you have an access log there. For instance, if it's another HTTP or a Tomcat or something similar, often that notation is sufficient to add it to the access log there. But often you want to have it in application log files. And for this, I can only give you hints. Typically, application logging frameworks like Log4j, they have a concept called MDC, Map Diagnostic Context. This is like a hash map where you can save values under a key at some point in processing, and then you can add it to every log line that's written. Yeah? And it's very easy to inject code, for instance, in Java web applications without changing the application itself. It's just a snippet that you can add as an independent component that picks up the request ID from the header and copies it into this hash table of the log framework. That's all you need to do, and automatically it will show up in every log line of the application. You don't have to touch your application code. Okay, number 6. Mod log debug, custom log lines. That's one thing I've found helpful in some cases, because sometimes you want to count things happening. And you know, it's always when the request is coming from IP such, and there was no session, and the URL looked like this, and then you start scripting and evaluating your log files. Funnily, you can also configure your web server to log a line if such conditions are true. So it's much easier to evaluate the log. And what you do is, first of all, you need to make sure that mod log debug is set to log level at least info, because many people run their web server with one log level, and then all of the output of mod log debug cannot be seen in the log file because it logs on info log level. So make sure you have actually at least info log level activated. And then, this is the trivial example, if someone hits the URI honeypot, we log a specific log message. That's the hello world example. But we can improve the example. First of all, if you like to get more information about the timing of the processing in the web server, we can choose here at what time during processing of the request the message actually gets logged. The web server processes requests in several hooks, and you can choose the hook, and all means log at every hook. So you won't get one message per honeypot request, but like 20 messages for every hook once. So then you can use variables. we replace our static log line by a dynamic log line where we include the IP of the client. So like mod headers, this also allows to use variables in the text. So it's getting more expressive. And then we can do more complex stuff like we use ModRewrite to check whether the cookie header contains some chase session ID. And then we capture the chase session ID and put it in an environment variable. So this ModRewrite doesn't rewrite the request. It's only used for the side effect. This means it matches everything. Don't change it, but set an environment variable. OK, and now we include the environment variable here. And I use the notation that I will explain in a minute that again comes from the general expression parser that Jim already mentioned and used several times. So we can get pretty creative here. So what is this notation request env? We have a unified expression parser. Traditionally, we had some kind of expressions in the config in several places, like in rewrite cont, you could do expressions, in setenv if, in SSL require, in allow deny, but all of these expressions were handcrafted and implemented in different ways. There were some analogies, but you couldn't rely on things working in one directive to also work in other directives. For instance, allow deny, you could always use net masks. It was important, describing networks not by regular expressions, but by net masks. But it wasn't working, for instance, in rewrite rules. You had to rephrase your network conditions as regular expressions. That's really ugly. Yeah? So we had the code for using net masks, but it was strictly related to some directives. Now there's a universal expression parser that's connected to all of the directives where you can use it. So every expression that works in one place works in all places. So we put more energy into it, so there's far more expressions now than you can use than the sum of all the expressions before. Every expression feature works in all places. And two nice things, sometimes people actually still code extensions to the web server. And this expression parser has two APIs. First of all, if you need some very specific function, you can code that function and tell the expression parser to make it available. So you define your function name, yeah, like my username, and then you derive the username from some header value in some internal way. And then you can use the function myUsername everywhere in the web server. For this, you need to write a little bit of C code, but it's pretty easy, this part. So you can extend the available functions by yourself. And the other thing is, if you're writing a module, you can use expressions by just calling the expression parser. So you can define your own module directives that contain expressions without needing to pass the expressions. It's all done by the expression parser. You just call it, and it tells you whether the result was true or false, for instance. Yeah. So the expression parser has two modes. The traditional mode, the first mode that was used was a Boolean mode. So the return was always just true or false, and you used it as a condition in your configuration. Nowadays, there's more and more use of a second mode, namely it returns a string. Like we had in modlog debug, where I said, please log the value of this environment variable. It's a text that it gets logged. So there's two modes, and the syntax varies a little bit on whether you want to get a Boolean or a string. And finally, the example we had, this is just saying, take the request environment variable named myvar and return the value of it as a string. So back to custom logging. What we can also do, we can add a Boolean expression which triggers the logging. So here I say do it only if the request comes from this network. Yeah, and then I get this message. So number 7, if with expressions. This is now the difference. For instance, here I could also say this is only done if this expression is true. But this means it's an extension to an existing directive, and it only is connected to this specific directive. Here, I define a whole block of configuration lines, And all of these configuration lines are only activated if the expression is true. And the configuration lines do not need to know anything about expressions. Yeah? So this is a whole block of expressions. For instance, I say I have a location internal. If the request comes from this network, then I set options indexes, then I allow directory listings, and else I deny access, something like this. So there is an if, there is an else, and there is also an else if. Now, of course, these directives here can only get effective once we have the data for the expression. So often you need to have some data from the request in the expression, some header line, something like this. That means during the very early phases of request processing, we don't have that available. So all of the configuration lines between the if blocks will not be active during these very early phases, because we first need the data to check the condition before we can decide about the contents of the block. So some ideas about the abilities of the expression parser. You can check whether something is in a list of words. You can do regular expression matching, also case independent. You can do IP matching, string matching, string caseless matching, file name matching, so like globs. You can put header values, request and response header values, environment variables. You can convert strings from uppercase to lowercase, percent encoding, MD5 hashes. There's lots of stuff you can use. You can directly use in your expressions, and it's growing. So if expression is also nice for debugging, for instance, we can increase the log level just when only when the request comes from a specific network. Yeah, so that's very helpful, and you can do other things as well, like looking for a specific user agent or some other values or session IDs or whatever. So then something which is I'll have to look for the time actually. Oh, lots of time. Something that's not well known is named back references. When this was committed, I first learned about named back references, didn't know about it. There is 3 directives with the name location match, files match, and directory match. They are very similar to location, directory, and files. I'm sure most of you will know these directives. Match, first of all, indicates it's not about just prefixes. You can do any regular expression match inside these directives. But they have an interesting side effect. Sometimes in the block that's denoted by location match, you want to use the match that happened inside your configuration directives. And typically in the ModRewrite style, you would try to use $1, $2 to back reference something that's in another line. But that will not work because there is no direct relation between location match and what's inside. But there is a notation to do it. How would you do it? Regular expressions come with the ability to give bracket groups names. So this question mark and then lower than, bigger than sign denote the name. I've chosen the name context. That's some name I have given. And whatever is matched here will be put into a group named context by regular expression mechanisms. So what is it that's matched here? It's just the first path segment. Yeah, I have a slash and then any character before the next slash, that's put into the group named context. And then I use this group inside here in a totally different directive. For instance, this says we require some LDAP group. So we make user checks via LDAP. And we require some LDAP group, and in the group name, in the common name, I use the value of the context variable here. It's not a variable, of the context group. And this is just, by definition, we put a named a group into an environment variable with the name match underscore, and then the uppercase of the group name. Yeah, that's just by definition. So if I would have put here path, then it would have been match path. Yeah? So that way you can use any groups that you define in location match, directory match, or files match inside. I think it's for making it unambiguous. For instance, assume you have rewrite rules inside the block. And then what does $1 then mean? Is it referring to the rewrite rule left side? So $1 typically means something that's very close. And if we would have used it, we would have run into conflicts with other uses of it. Yeah, but that would have been an argument to change it in many more places. We didn't. I think it was driven by reducing conflicts.
Then, like once you exit the location match, this variable is gone.
I'd say no. I would say no. Variables are not deleted. Yes, yes. It puts it into the environment table. I would be surprised if it would be deleted at the end. But I'm not sure, but I would be. Yes, yes. Okay. Then something Jim also mentioned, it's mod remote IP, getting the client IP address right. This is something that happens very frequently, and this is not about your web server being a proxy. This is about in front of your web server being another proxy. Like, often nowadays, load balancers are running in a reverse proxy mode to save connections. So they hide the original client IP address from your precious web server. And all you get in your access log is the IP address of the load balancer. That's not very fascinating. That's what you know. But sometimes you need to know the client IP address to make analysis and correlations, etc. So how do you get it? And of course, first of all, the system in front needs to pass it in some way along to you. We're talking HTTP, it's extensible, so there should be a header which contains the original IP address. Do we need to invent something new? No. Actually, actually, there is a more or less standard header I will show in a minute. But first of all, the idea of mod remote ID is it looks at some header coming from the web server in front of you and picks the request, the client IP from there, and then it adds it to several places where Apache uses client IP addresses. And what immediately comes probably also to your mind is the access log, yeah, where you log client IP addresses. And also if you do IP-based access checks, require IP, yeah, where you say only allow access if the client is in some network. Yeah.
So, basic difference between this header and X404 is that the Apache Web Server is intermediate after
No, it is about X404. I'll come to that on the next slide. It is about X404. I'll come to that point in a second. Your question? Your question?
As far as I know, it might be harmful to log the
right.
user's IP address because it's personal data.
Yes, yes, yes. That depends on your jurisdiction. Also, it might, depending on your jurisdiction, logging is okay, but you need to get rid of it quickly enough. It's a question of on how long you keep it. For instance, you can, at least in Germany, currently, it's considered enough to drop the last byte, although we know that the last byte might not be enough, but it's considered to be state-of-the-art, dropping the last byte, and then you can keep it for a longer time. But keeping it short time should be okay. But you need to decide, of course, yeah. And now, what is this X-forwarded for? So there is some semi-standard header called X-forwarded for. Most reverse proxy automatically set it, and even, for instance, if Apache itself is a reverse proxy, it automatically sets it. So if the web server in front of you is an Apache, it will already set a header called X-forwarded for and include the client IP address there. And all of the other reverse proxies I know, for instance, load balancers, have very easy ways to set that. So if the admin people there look at their knowledge base X-forwarded for, they immediately find a recipe how to activate that. So you can use any header you like, but mostly X-forwarded4 gets used because it's very easy to set it. So typically you get an X-forwarded4 header that already contains the client IP address. In reality, it can contain a list of addresses, because if you have a chain of proxies in front of you, everyone might add another address there. So what do? We have some security implications. Headers can be set by any client. Yeah, you can easily set an arbitrary HTTP header. But we want to use a header value to do IP-based access control or log it in our access log. So better, it's the truth that's in there and not something your user invented. So what's important is that you only use this machinery if you know that the proxy in front of you overrides the header, controls the header, does not just pass through the garbage it gets. That means for us to be on the safe side, we should only evaluate the header if the request actually comes from the proxy. So that's what we need to configure. So we have a very simple configuration. This I commented out because it's already the default value. Just to show you, you can use another header as well. Yeah? And this is which header we look at. And this here is a list of IP addresses from which the connection should come in so that we actually activate this procedure. Yeah? If the request comes from another peer, we do not trust the value. The client IP that's taken from the list is removed from the list. Okay, and what I forgot to say, but I had it on the slide, the write pattern in the access log format is %A for address. The default access log format has a %H for hostname of the client. H means it writes the IP address if no hostname resolution is active, which is the default. If hostname resolution would be active, it would write the name, the resolved name of the client. But H doesn't have the remote IP logic inside, so A is the right pattern to use.
So it tries to resolve the
H only tries to resolve, but only if you activate resolution, not by default. Okay. Number 10, it's also a funny thing that I learned when someone committed it. SSL, OpenSSL conf command, that's probably the most weird directive name that was created for Apache. The point is, the SSL TLS world has lots of options. And whenever OpenSSL or the TLS standards create new ways to influence what's happening, we need to create a new directive to wire that to our configuration file. Yeah, and if you look at ModSSL, it has a long list of options to influence what's happening. But sometimes the things are very simple. It's like setting a binary flag or giving a file with some content to ModSSL. So the same problem was occurring for any applications that were using SSL and OpenSSL as an implementation. They all had the problem of constantly creating new directives. So finally, the OpenSSL team itself decided to help. And they created a generic configuration API where they said, just throw us a string into this API. We will pass it and know how to behave. So we will have our own configuration language. Yeah? So the cons is there's a new configuration language. It's not anymore Apache directive, but the pros is whenever they create something new and you use their newest version, you can already use the configuration for this new stuff. Yeah? So the up-to-date list of commands that is available can be found under this URL. It's just 3 ones because every major version brings new stuff with it. As an example, this is the directive. And then this is the name of the configuration command. These names are listed in the OpenSSL documentation. You have a list of such names. And this is the value that we pass over. So the API is not just one string, it's a key value API. And what does it do? In this specific case, it disables session tickets and enables preference of the server configuration. So actually these two existed before. SSL session tickets off is a specific directive. It does nothing else than just this here. It was just created to switch the support for session tickets off. And server preference, parts of what it does is done by SSL on a cipher order on. So you could say you don't need it, but you will need it for newer features. Because I guess when the demand occurs to create even more directives for SSL, we will have a look on whether the OpenSSL API already supports parsing it along in this way and not implement every flag by itself. And for instance, this one didn't exist for a long time. There was a patch around for a long time until we actually noticed and committed it. Okay. Bonus, that's number 11, only for if we have enough time, and we do have the time. The bonus is there's some support binaries coming with the Apache, like ht-parsvd or parswd or rotate logs. And also these binaries sometimes get nice improvements. And one of the nice improvements in the ht-parswd binary is it supports bcrypt hashing nowadays. Yeah, so if you still have your old crypt hashed password files lying around in the Apache Web Server, think about modernizing them. There is some nice way to get more security there. And the other thing is rotate logs got some features like it has time and size-based rotation configuration, and you can combine them. So you can say, for instance, rotate every 10 megabytes, but also rotate daily. So then, at the end of the day, all of your log data will have been rotated away, but none of the chunks will be bigger than 10 megabytes. So you can combine these. There's an option to create a stable link, like your log file always has a timestamp behind. But in addition, there is a hard link without a timestamp that always points to the last log file. That's something that makes looking at the last log file easier. And there's optional post-rotate processing. For instance, you can define that after rotation, a process is forked that compresses the log file. Okay, that's it. We still have time for a few questions. Yes? Yeah. I asked the organizers. They said, please send it to us. We will publish them, but I don't know where they will publish them. So in the meantime, take this address and I will send it to you. I won't do anything with your email address. It's just you haven't signed the new European need, so I can't do anything with your email address. So any more question? No? So then thanks for listening and have fun with the web server.